Hello,
Good.
everyone, and welcome to the Gamification Revolution. I'm your host, Gabe Zickerman. I'm here today with Andrea Kuszewski, the lovely, talented Andrea Kuszewski. Hi.
Hello. Hi.
So excited to have you here and to have all of you here today for our 30-minute talk about everything that's exciting about engagement and gamification. Before we get started, I want to remind you that you can click these buttons to submit a question or come on camera. If you have anything to ask Andrea or me, we're here to answer your questions and talk about like the latest and hottest topics on the subject. And you can come see Andrea or me and me at Gamification Summit in April, April 16th through the 18th in San Francisco. And you can find out more about that at G Summit and use the code GREV to save money on your ticket. So, okay, so Andrea, let's just take a big step back. Tell everybody why it is that if we care about engagement, why do we need to care about the science of the brain?
Well, because not everything is created equal, first of all. So when you're looking at wanting to engage people, and people say, "I want to include, gamification in my curriculum or program or treatment plan or whatever," so they say, "Okay, I'm going to throw some badges in there, and then we're going to change everyone's behavior." Well, if someone doesn't really care about badges, they're not going to change their behavior based on what you're doing. So it's like I hear people that say, "Oh, I gamified this or that." It's like, "Oh, really? What'd you do?" And I'm expecting this elaborate thing. It's like, "Well, I added badges and points or something like that." It's like, well, that's not really engagement. Your brain, it's like it's a very sensitive thing. You can like something, you can award someone a point. And they say, "Yeah, I like getting points." But that isn't necessarily going to motivate them to take an action. Liking something and being motivated by something are two different things. And that's where the science comes in. And people often forget that. Sometimes they overlap a lot, but they're actually two different things.
So what is
And
it?
actually,
Yeah, what is it that what do we know and what do we not know about the science of motivation that's kind of like stands in our way of designing good engagement?
okay, well, let me tell you a little story, because I like telling little stories. This is when I was a therapist and I had a client, and I was meeting with his mom for the first time, and the kid wasn't even in the room. So I'm just meeting with her, and I'm doing the standard, questions. I'm finding out about the situation because I'm going to design a treatment plan for this kid. And so I ask, what are the main challenges here? And she's like, well, nothing motivates him. Nothing. She's like, we tried everything. The kid cannot be motivated. It's terrible. It's actually causing a big problem. And I looked at her, and I hadn't even met the kid yet. I didn't even know what he looked like. But I said, I'm sorry, but that's bullshit. I said, everyone's motivated by something. You just don't know what it is yet. And I'll be honest, that was a tough kid to crack. It was difficult. So it was causing all these problems because people were trying to motivate him. They were going out of their way to like at school give him stickers and candy and money for doing good things. They're trying to find all the positives and reward them, which you should do. But they were forgetting to take into account looking into what motivated him specifically. So I went to school, and after getting to know him for a couple of days, I went and observed and I watched what was going on. And he just like angry, and every time that they would try to reward him, he would like stab a kid with a pencil, just outburst, and just like he would get more angry. It was like opposite of what they wanted. And they're like, we don't know what to do. Nothing motivates him. And so what I found out was that he had really strong sensory issues. So when people had a high pitch like, hey, that was like, whoa, it's like you're, ice pick in my ear. He hated the high excited things. He didn't like people making a big deal about what he was doing. What motivated him was getting more work to do because he was a really smart kid. And what he wanted was that recognize that I did this thing, just acknowledge that I did it, and just let me do some more hard stuff. And that is what gets him motivated. So we worked out where every time he would do something good and finish it, all the teacher would do, thumbs up, no reaction, no high-pitched squealing, nothing, and then gave him more work to do. And it worked beautifully. For him, that was motivation. So that kept him challenged. He wanted to do more. His behavior was good. So for him, that was his motivational plan, But it isn't always what you think. So the big point from that is that what is rewarding and what's motivating is not always what you think it is. It depends on who your audience is.
So this brings us to kind of an interesting sort of point and question, right? Which is, um, And yeah, it's an absolutely great takeaway. Thanks for pointing that out, Gary, in the chat. We have some questions already queued up from other folks, but tell
Mhm.
me, how is it, like, what is it that you do now, Andrea, and how is it that you come to this place that you are today in terms of being this expert on motivation?
Well, I started out as a behavior therapist, and basically it was trying to find children that were difficult to motivate and finding ways to get them to change their behavior, do really difficult things that were very challenging for them. They didn't want to do it. They had all of these, psychological problems, autism, ADHD, all of these things going on that were standing in the way of their progress. And I wanted them to go from here to like here. And it was really difficult. So how am I going to get them to do that? So I need to figure out the first thing that any therapist, or if you're in marketing or any kind of business where you're trying to get people to change their behavior, the first thing you need to do is spend time up front finding out what motivates that cohort, that child, that audience, that group of people that you want as customers. And if you don't spend your time figuring out what motivates them, you're wasting your time. You could develop an elaborate marketing plan, beautiful, clever, all of these things, but if the target audience that you're trying to reach is not motivated by what you're selling, you're wasting your time. They're not going to change their behavior. So
How
you need to start
how
by
do you figure that out?
yeah, go ahead. How?
Yeah.
Watching what they do. Well, some of it, like when I was a therapist, what I would do is just introduce the kid to different situations and watch their behavior. What makes them change their behavior? What kinds of things get them to move in this direction versus this direction? And I would take note of that. What kinds of things completely turn them off? And then you want to stay away from those things. So when you're doing research on either a single client or a group of people that you're trying to reach, finding out what they like, what gets them to change their behavior, like what are the thresholds? Like people will stay in a pattern of behavior even if they're not really that happy, because the action to actually change your path, if it's too much of a hassle and it's kind of aggravating, they're just going to stay in, not very happy rather than take that step. So you need to find out what is the one thing that will make them actually take that step. What's worth it for them in order to change their behavior? And really, it's different for every group of people. So you really have to do some research on that.
And so one of the things that that I think many people know you best for, and certainly the way that I kind of come to know you, is the your discussion about cognitive enhancement. We have some kind of questions about it,
Mhm.
but so now, what do you do today? What is the focus of your work now?
Yes, well, actually, I've shifted a little bit. I decided, because I really like challenges. So I was like, my new challenge, if I can influence people on a certain level, I thought I was trying to, can I scale up my impact? So now I'm actually working at a life science marketing firm. And all of our clients are companies that have scientists either as consumers or customers, or they're trying to reach the scientist population. And everyone knows, anyone that's in marketing knows that that is probably one of the most difficult cohorts to try to use marketing strategies with, because they hate marketing. It's a very difficult group to reach. So the key is really finding out the psychology of the scientist, what motivates them, what they like, what they don't like, and then using that information to try to, create situations that get them to want to change their behavior.
Interesting. And for those of you who are just joining us, I'm Gabe Zickerman. We're here on the Gamification Revolution with the brilliant and talented Andrea Kuszewski, expert in cognition, behavior, and motivation. And so, Andrea, I made reference to it earlier, but one of the ways that I kind of actually, before we do this, a great question from Agnieszka from Poland. She asks, are scientists in some way like children? Um, is there an interesting connection in your previous work working with children and your current work working with scientists in terms of figuring out ways to motivate them?
You know what? Amazingly similar on some respects. Because when I came into now the marketing realm, I had no marketing experience really, but I had a lot of experience in getting children and parents and teachers and educators to change their behavior. So when I look at, okay, well now I'm trying to get scientists to change their behavior or feel a certain way about something. You kind of have to go about it in the same way, where sometimes it's very nuanced. It seems like they don't like anything, but they're very specific about the things they do like, and so you have to try to find the ends where you get them and go with it. Even if it sounds counterintuitive or crazy, you got to kind of go down that path, because it doesn't matter how you think a campaign or a game or a strategy should look. If it's not reaching that audience, it doesn't matter. You're better off just going with that one little nuanced thing that they like, and go with that. You're going to have a lot more success.
It's fascinating. Most of the scientists that I know are quite childlike, both in a good way and in a bad way,
Yeah.
I guess. But so,
Yeah.
so
Well,
I
there's
was
like
thinking,
that curiosity aspect where
yeah,
they like, it's kind of like when you think about those five things that enhance your cognition. What do all those things do? What do they all do? They all increase your motivation to actually learn more things.
well,
Seeking novelty
yeah,
triggers dopamine.
tell us about the
Yeah.
five principles of cognitive enhancement, which is how I came to know your work and how many people I think first come to know your work in this area.
Well, what's kind of exciting is that it wasn't until actually recently that I realized just how much all of this fit together. And you'll be happy to know this, because some recent research came out that makes the name of your company even more relevant to gamification. Basically, there's this, let's talk about dopamine. Okay, everyone says dopamine, it's known for a lot of things, pleasure, motivation, sexual desire, all of these different things. It's involved in a lot of things, but people thought it was primarily this pleasure neurotransmitter, right? So, but what they found over the years is that they were finding people that were in times of high stress, where it was like a negative situation. There would be elevated dopamine levels in their brain. We're like, what's going on here? If it's supposed to be pleasure related, why are these negative events triggering dopamine? Like PTSD victim, soldiers, they hear gunfire and dopamine spikes, and like, well, what's going on here? So what they realize is that the primary function of dopamine is not pleasure. It's involved with pleasure, but the primary function is motivation. And it doesn't matter if it's motivation to do something positive, or motivation to avoid something, or motivation to take an action from where you are currently. So dopamine, yes, is involved in pleasure. It's kind of like it's a multifaceted neurotransmitter, but they found that the overriding primary function of dopamine is as a motivator. The recent study I was mentioning is that they took rats and they had food that they found out that the rats liked, because they ate most of it. So they liked this food, and you would think, oh, they like something, dopamine, pleasure, right? So what they did was they took these rats then, and some of them, they can manipulate how much dopamine is getting in their brain. So some of them, they depleted a lot of the dopamine. So you would think low pleasure, right? So the rats that were depleted of dopamine, they would eat the food if it was in front of them because they liked it. But if there was like a more challenging maze to get through to get to the food, they were like, don't want anything to do with it. They just didn't care. They were not motivated to take that action. So even though you can like something or understand that this is a paired association, that's separate from making you want to take an action. So they found it's actually two distinct different mechanisms. They're very often paired together, but they are distinct. So wrapping that back around to, the five principles is that when it comes to learning, the biggest influencer of how much a child learns is how motivated they are to even put forth the effort to learn. You can put a child in front of things that are boring and they don't like, and they'll crank through them, and yes, they will improve on their test scores, and they will learn, but they're not going to be learning at the level they could if they were actually motivated to be there.
So what are the five principles of cognitive enhancement? Because we haven't actually talked about them.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so the five principles are, first of all, seek novelty, always looking for new things, new situations, new things to learn. Challenging yourself, meaning you want to set your goals at a barely achievable level. I mean, like barely to the point where you don't even know if you can achieve it, but you probably can. That's exactly where you want to be, because that situation right there is a big trigger for dopamine. When there's a challenge put in front of you, and you see it like, oh, I think I can do this. You're on a quest. You're in a game. And it's in front of you. Not if it's too hard, it's not going to do it. You're like overkill. You're not going to want to do that. But if it's challenging and not too easy, that's the biggest trigger for dopamine, and that's the big motivator. The third one is doing things the hard way. So if you're doing things easy, mindlessly, you're not really activating much of your brain, and you're not going to get as much of an effect. So it kind of goes along with challenging yourself, where you want when you get to the point of mastery of something, you need to move on to the next level, like immediately. Because as soon as you get fluent, your brain starts dropping a little bit. If you want to stay at the top and keep that dopamine going, keep that positive feedback loop, you got to immediately go to the next level as soon as you as soon as you get there. The fourth one is thinking creatively. Of course, making new connections. There's always more than one way to solve a problem, and the more ways you conceptualize a problem, the more connections you're making, and the more learning that takes place. And then, of course, the last one is networking, the social aspect. When you network with other people, you're just increasing all of those aspects because you're looking at things from different perspectives. And so those are basically the five. But how dopamine plays in is that all of those five things all trigger dopamine. Yeah.
Yes, and dopamine is so important, and we're going to talk more about it. So Achin's question, which I think is really interesting, and thanks for asking this, Achin, which is the doing things the hard way piece of the five principles, which is, I think so interesting. How do we keep people from? How do we balance the level of difficulty there? Because I think when you say do things the hard way, and you say like push yourself right to the edge and just over the edge, God, that is such a thin margin, Andrea, between too hard and people being pushed out and too easy and not getting the benefit of it. So how do we get into that zone, and how do we know even if we're in that zone?
It's really difficult, but there are some algorithms that I think it's okay. When I took the GREs for grad school, it's called item response theory. It's like you take, they throw some questions at you that are a certain level of difficulty, and if you get them right, okay, they bump up the difficulty a little bit. If you get that one wrong, they bump it down a little bit, and they keep doing that, and they develop a baseline where what they think your level is at. So if you think about, and then they adjust all the rest of the questions based on that. So if you're getting too many wrong, they'll bump it down a little bit, make it a little bit easier. And then if you're getting too many of those right, they'll bump up the difficulty a little bit more. So if you're thinking about a game, if someone is flying through all the levels really quickly, it's probably too easy. If they're stuck on a single level for a really long time, it might be too difficult. But if they're engaging with that level a lot and they're keeping at it, it may be really difficult, but they may still really be enjoying it because maybe there's enough stuff going on that they're still exploring. It's novelty. They're uncovering new things. So it's kind of like if a game is designed so that it could take the feedback from the user, and you're looking at their progress and then how the length of time that they're playing the game. If they're only doing it for short bursts, they're probably not that interested. If they're going for like 4 hours at a time, you kind of got something going there. So you look at what's going on right there. How difficult is it? How fast are they progressing? And you're kind of near the sweet spot at that time. So if they're engaging for longer and longer periods of time, you're approaching that it's difficult, but not too difficult.
And actually we have I think that's a great question, and thanks, great answer too. Thanks, Chin, for asking that question. Now we have Seamus actually has been patiently waiting to come on screen and actually ask a little question of you live and in person. So let's see if we've got Seamus here.
Yeah,
hey,
can
Seamus,
you hear me?
can you hear us? Yeah.
Yes.
Hi.
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 Can you hear me?
Yes, of course we can.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Yes, I can.
I just had a little technical difficulty when I signed on. So my question was I work specifically with metacognitive thinking, dealing with formative assessment. I was an educator for about a decade, worked for a company called Mind Lab, and Mind Lab was more in favor of sticking with a kinesthetic program where they used handheld board games as opposed to the adaptive learning platform that we were developing for mobile apps, etc. Now, our primary focus, and had been for about 20 years, was dealing with metacognitive thinking skills as the foundation for improving learning and engagement and secured knowledge across content, whether it be real-life examples or they be, specific to, say, math, science, ELA, etc. Now, I know C8 Sciences, Dr. Bruce Wexler and Ken Coleman, they're focusing very much on the science of metacognitive thinking and creating the algorithms to develop the mapping of the brain and dealing with gamification in this regard. I wanted to know if there was anybody else that was really pushing metacognitive thinking as a way to design the platforms for the games that they are making for improving both engagement and the learning.
Yeah, you know what? I don't know of anyone specifically that's doing that, but it would be really awesome if someone was, because that's a smart idea. You know, look at the users. How are they interacting with your game, and what are their behaviors, and then designing it based on that. Not what you think is a cool game and then throwing it out there. Really looking into what would make this user, especially if it's for education, what is going to make this child go above and beyond in order to learn math? If the kid hates math. You know, you can't just throw badges and points on something and think that it's going to work magic. You know, it probably won't.
Well,
so is that what you're asking? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, my observation in looking at people who've been really successful using a combination of games and or gamification and learning specifically seems to be that the common pattern is that a very good teacher, just my observation, a very good teacher is paired with a fundamentally interesting, well-designed, gamified system. So when we've looked at ones, like when I've seen the ones that have really been breakthroughs, and it's worth for all of those of you who are not familiar with some of these concepts, it's worth checking out on gsummit.com. You can watch videos from previous speakers at Gamification Summit. The next one, of course, coming up in April, as many of you know. But if you go to gsummit.com, you can check out a couple of talks from previous speakers. We're going to put the URLs in the chat in a second, but the guys are Tim Vandenberg and Anant Pai, both of whom gamified their classrooms using actually fairly broadly available games. In the case of Mr. Vandenberg, it was Monopoly. And in Anant Pai's case, it was a wide range of digital games. And they paired that actually with really good teaching. And so what the teacher was doing was, to a great extent, this sort of metacognitive thing that you've been describing, pairing the lesson and the student and the modality and making sure that everything was happening at the right level, because the software is not yet at the point where it's capable of doing that in an effective way on its own.
That's really the question that I'm trying to get to. I guess I'm sorry, there's a lot of educational jargon in there that I was spewing out. But with the case with Monopoly, you know, he's got this fantastic, you know, math adaptation of the game for, you know, teaching the subject. But that's a very specific game that has a lot of restrictions on it. I know Monopoly has a lot of metaphorical and analogical, you know, adaptations to lots of other areas of life. But what we were doing at my, sorry.
I think what it boils down to is it's a great business opportunity for you, and you should get involved in this. Thanks so much for coming on. I'm going to move on to the next question.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for being there. Thank you.
Thank you.
How festive and awesome is that? And for those of you just joining us, it's Gabe Zickerman. I'm here on the Gamification Revolution with Andrea Kuszewski, expert in cognition and behavior. And we're talking all about different questions about motivation and the brain. And you know, one question that we have here from Mark Christopoulos. Thanks for that question, and again, thanks to Seamus for coming on online with us live. So Mark is wondering about the effect of pleasure and learning. Why is you know, he's curious to know, why is learning actually pleasurable? What do we get out of that evolutionarily, if anything? And I want to add to that question, why is it not pleasurable for so many people? What's the gap, and can we bridge it?
Well, I think part of it, why it's not pleasurable for some people, is it's either too boring or it's too hard, not moving along fast enough, not interesting enough. It's not motivating enough for them. I think that's why some people hate learning, because they're not motivated to actually take the steps that it does to learn. Because if you really want to learn at the highest level possible, it's not easy. It's really hard work. So in order to do that hard work, you have to make it really motivating. So, you know, learning in itself is pleasurable because, you know, it's that positive feedback loop with dopamine again. You know, dopamine is related to pleasure, and it's also related to motivation. So when something is in front of you and it's challenging, and you accomplish that, you get that feeling of, whoa, I just did something pretty awesome. And then that pleasure response, that dopamine, motivates you to move on to the next one. And if you capitalize on that flood of dopamine when it hits, and you keep it going and you stay in that loop, that's when you can get on the really high learning curve. So learning new things, it is the novelty too. You know, we get bored with stuff. Humans, we don't like boredom. We like new things. You know, when you think about evolutionary perspective, I mean, wow, if you're living in the bush and, you know, there's animals chasing you and stuff, if, you know, you got to kind of stay alert. So noticing different things and picking up on little changes, and, you know, that's beneficial to your survival. So it would make sense that when you accomplish things and you learn something new and you apply that to a new situation, it benefits your survival. It's going to have a positive impact. But in modern times, learning is pleasurable because there is that novelty, there's that sense of accomplishment, and then taking what you've already learned and applying it to something new, it's kind of like a new spin on that. That's where the creativity comes in. That's also pleasurable. That also triggers dopamine. So all of these things kind of work together. And the trick is finding that sweet spot and once you have that momentum, kind of keep everything, keeping the fire fueled, keeping everything going.
I mean, this is the interesting this is, I think, part of, I often talk about and why I love having you so much speak at Gamification Summit and why your talks have been so well received. I think one of the natural kind of intersections is between, in gamification, is between the science of dopamine and the science of cognition and the art of designing experiences that are engineered to maximize this particular loop. And everything, as you've been talking, I'm noticing we keep talking about threading this needle very carefully, putting users between,
Yes.
Between sort of pleasure, between anxiety and boredom, and the kind of Csikszentmihalyi flow sort of model. Do you think it's possible for people to do that to themselves, or do they need a system to do it for them?
I think people can do it to themselves. I mean, I think I do it to myself automatically. I think because I've been doing it so long, it's now just I automatically know which things that I introduce myself to are too challenging, which ones are, I can accomplish this. So I've kind of gotten to know myself and know where my sweet spot is, where now it's like every single thing I encounter, I know immediately how to like put myself in there. And when I was working as a therapist, I would get that way with each of my clients because I would get to know them so well that I could very easily find their sweet spot and then just like tweak it as things come up and kind of keep them in that spot for a really long time, which is why they had so much progress. So I think just with experience, you kind of learn that. So people can, I think, do that for themselves, but
Well,
you can design it for other people too.
Yeah, and you're talking about this experience. Part of why we teach these gamification workshops, for example, which we'll teach the next one at G Summit, is to try to get people exposed to and get the experience of how to design these things and learn, the kind of best practice to being able to do that. But one of the topics that you sort of keep hitting on, which I think is interesting, is the question of habituation. And one of my questions for you, and we've got another question or two queued up here. One of my questions for you, so this research comes out, I think it was just a couple of weeks ago, on habituation, a romantic habituation. And it said that the reason, after about 2 years on average, people in a romantic relationship lose that kind of spark that happens between themselves and their partner, and their relationship shifts from romantic affection to companionship affection. So romantic intimacy to companionship intimacy. Many people at that point feel bad about themselves and bad about their relationships. And the core behavior there is habituation, right? We no longer feel the highs that we used to get from that same experience. That experience is now normal. So my question for you, if sex and love and intimacy has such a short runway, it's got 2 years, and I don't mean, I'm not casting aspersions on anyone, but if sex and love and intimacy has only 2 years, what hope do people have of building systems beyond that can keep people engaged and motivated and not bored beyond the 2 year mark?
Well, I think the key is really taking all those elements that make you want to continue to do something that's difficult and applying it to a new system, which is a relationship. And you could be real cheeky and say gamification of relationships, but in reality, what's going to keep you motivated? So constant, not getting in the same old rut, keeping things novel. And you can take that to a whole bunch of different degrees, but keeping some novelty in there, learning new things together. So it's like you want to keep challenging yourself and being exposed to all these new things, but if you do it as a couple, you're kind of, you're enhancing that relationship then, but you're still getting that, that novelty and the dopamine from all those new experiences, but you're doing it with your significant other.
I think
and also just,
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I'm saying that if, and also remembering that, how we all like incentives, we like knowing that we did something good, that we're, what we did was valid or important, remembering to do that too in your relationship. because it does make a difference. If you know that you did something good and you get recognition for that, it kind of, gives you a little bit of a spring in your step and kind of motivates you to keep doing those things. So, it's not like in the behavioral psychology circles, we joke around that you sit there with like a little bag of treats, and every time your boyfriend, remembers to call you when he's going to be late, you give him a little treat, But it's kind of, it's kind of like that, the behaviors that you want to see increasing, you want to reinforce those in whatever ways are motivating for that person. And the behaviors you don't want to see more of, you don't reinforce them.
So,
and that's a whole different conversation.
No. I mean, I think this reinforcement, and we could talk for an hour. Our time's coming to a close, and at some point, you and I should get back together and get some more people and talk about behavioralism, because it's a hot topic, and again, 60 years later. But okay, so we have the last question here from Michael Choros, and thanks for that question, and thanks Mark and everyone else who's asked questions today. So Michael's asking a question about motivating someone who's on the far opposite side of the political spectrum. So how you get someone who's a Democrat, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, to do something that might go against your, maybe some of your instincts. And just to sort of spin this, you talked a little bit about it with the child we were talking about earlier in the therapy case. But how do we overcome these initial huge resistances that people might have? There are sort of entrenched behaviors or beliefs to be able to drive them towards a different kind of behavior, belief set, or outcomes.
Well, regarding the political persuasion, and this is actually something I've written about before. I don't know if you remember that article I wrote about the neuroscience of liberals and conservatives, but I actually picked apart this whole situation. And the bottom line is really looking into people that are not that Democrats and Republicans are different by birth. It's people that affiliate themselves with these parties. So if someone says, I consider myself a Democrat, that tends to be a different kind of personality type as someone that says, I consider myself a Republican. And what we've noticed in the brains of these people is that different things motivate them, different things drive them, different things turn them off. And there's different ways to get through to that audience. So if you're trying to, let's say, convince someone who is, let's say, a conservative, and we know that they are more likely to have a negative response to disgust. They are more driven by emotion. Whereas liberals are more driven by logic. A lot of scientists are liberals for that reason. When you think about the scientific method, logic and reasoning, and people that are more religious, that tend to be more conservative, you notice them being driven more by emotional things, family values and things like that. So if you know that about your audience, so that's the number one thing, learn your audience, find out what motivates them, and then you look at what are you trying to sell them, what are you trying to convince them of. If you come at a conservative who's, let's say, is driven by emotion, and you come at them with a logical argument, you're probably not going to get very far. They're just going to cement their ground because you're not getting through to them. But if you look at your issue on a level that they can relate to, you reframe it into something that they can relate to on a personal, emotional level, you're going to get a lot further. Like, let's say climate change, okay? Say, okay, but look at the scientific data. Climate change is happening, all this stuff. You know what? Scientists will look at the data, and that's motivating for them to do something about it. But someone who is more driven by emotion, that's like so far from their everyday that, they don't really care. They're not listening to you long enough. But if you reframe that in, how much are you paying for your home bill, your heating bill? How much did you pay last month? How much did you pay last year? How much did it increase? How much do you think you're going to be paying next year? Suddenly now it's a much more personal level. And then you frame that argument in, okay, so your heating bill is going up, and that means you're going to have less money for this and that because, global warming, it's having this effect on your income and your family, your health, safety. So when you reframe the argument in terms of what drives that population, you're going to have a much better case of getting through to them.
Well, that's awesome, and such a great question to end on. Thank you so much, Michael, and Seamus, Mark, Achint, everyone who asked the question, and of course, thank you, Andrea Kuszewski, for joining us today. You can come and see Andrea and me and 50 or so other folks over 3 days at Gamification Summit in April in San Francisco. That's at gsummit.com, and you can watch great videos there. All the different topics related to gamification and engagement that are interesting to you. I'll be back on the Gamification Revolution next week with our guest Elise Olding from Gartner Group, who's one of the preeminent researchers on the subject of gamification, and talking about what the latest is in market data around the subject matter at our new date and time, Thursday afternoons. So on behalf of myself, everyone here, Andrea, thanks so much for joining us on the Gamification Revolution. Keep having fun.
Thank you for having me. Yep. Bye.
Bye.